as we saw this program come together, I got really very excited about pairing our last two speakers with our final speaker, Josh Boger. Because the science you've heard about is absolutely extraordinary. My head's still spinning about female fish that make sperm. Sorry, Ryan. And certainly being around Mike, understanding the extraordinary technologies from growth to processing to extraction that Mike Walsh just talked about. But in order for all this to happen, there needs to be successful businesses. There needs to be investment. There needs to be some very traditional things, which all of my students hear us talk about in class, things like customers, and investors, and profits. And I think no one understands sort of how to bring this together better than our last speaker, Josh Boger, well known both as the founder of Vertex Pharmaceuticals, but also as a real progressive voice for the role business can play in the future of our society. I think that's more than enough introduction, and I'll turn it over to you.
No, that's not the first one. You're number 3. You have to go up. There we go. Right there.
Okay. Started.
Thanks, Fred. I'm going to be quite brief because I'm really going to either tell you something you already know or tell you something that you will find very provocative and we can talk about. We started this afternoon really hearing a somewhat depressing, but I'm energized by problems, litany of issues with the oceans. We've come to focus later in the afternoon on particular technologies that could lead to us maybe damaging the oceans less and dealing with our growing population more efficiently. I'm often in fora around ethical issues and around societal issues, puzzled really with the paradox that almost everyone in the audience who's not a student works for a company, and almost everyone in the audience on topics like this believes corporations are part of the problem that is led to the issues that we discussed. I think that may or may not be true, but I think most people come to that conclusion because they actually have a very limited and actually fairly new-fashioned, not old-fashioned view of what a company is. And when you liberate yourself from the notion, the fairly new notion that companies have only one purpose, you can end up enlisting companies as part of the solution much easier. Anytime someone starts a business, there is a lot of choices that have to be made. What product you're going to bring, what product or service you're going to bring. But before you even get to that choice, you have to think about what your mission is. What are you trying to accomplish as a business? And when I say that to some audiences, again, not already primed to think about ethical issues, they will say, well, that isn't a choice. The purpose of a business is to make money. And the reason they say that is because of this guy. This is Milton Friedman, won the Nobel Prize in economics at some point in time. In 1969, he was on the front of Time magazine. He is the most influential economist measured by what most people on the street think about economics. I think he's also completely wrong on almost every conclusion he ever made, including the ones he won the Nobel Prize for. He said in one of his books written after that Time magazine cover, few trends could so thoroughly undermine the very foundations of our free society as the acceptance by corporate officials of a social responsibility other than to make as much money for their stockholders as possible. I think if you ask the man on the street, is that true or not true? They would say that's absolutely true. That's what they believe companies are designed to do. And indeed, you hear people say, how could it be otherwise? It turns out that this is a fairly new notion. It is not the way companies have always been thought about, and it certainly isn't the way that most companies think about themselves now. But there is a school of economics, and therefore a school of folks who run companies today who hold to this principle, which is I may have all kinds of values in my heart, but as the person who's running the company, I only have one constituency, and that is my stockholders, and my stockholders only have one goal, which is to make as much money as possible with their investment. That's called a mono-stakeholder hypothesis, and it turns out that it's really a new idea, and one that I think we all in this room, I would guess most of us believe has some bad effects. When I say it's a new hypothesis, very old corporations, iconic corporations of the 19th and 20th centuries held very much different viewpoints. This is one of my favorites. I was educated, as it were, at Merck and Company, where I got my first job and spent my first 10 years doing drug research. This is George Merck before I joined the company, not that old. 1952, also on the front of Time magazine, so he was a big shot even before Milton Friedman was a big shot on Time magazine. And George Merck said, we try never to forget that medicine is for the people, it's not for the profits. The profits will follow, and if we've remembered that, they have never failed to appear. Now, almost everybody who ever worked for Merck knows that quote, and it can be tossed off as, well, where was he? He was giving a speech at a medical college. He was already successful. Merck was already profitable. And of course, any big profitable company can say they're benevolent and they think about social good. His very next sentence makes that interpretation untenable. He didn't mean that he could afford to listen to the concerns of people. He actually said, and the better we have remembered that, the larger the profits have been. So he made a very radical statement in 1952. If we put the people first, we have found out that our profits actually are maximized. Notice, his goal is to put the people first and to put medicine first. And oh, by the way, it is the best business model. So it turns out that he has laid down the glove directly on the table, or rather in the face of Milton Friedman, and said, no, it's completely wrong. You've got it backwards. And this getting the purpose of corporations backwards, it can lead to all kinds of bad behavior. It doesn't mean that profits are a bad thing. He said in this same speech, of course, without profits, there can be no medicine, because there is no mechanism to get medicines to people ever conceived on the planet that doesn't involve profit-making enterprises. You can imagine them, go experiment with them. There are people who tried to put them together in Russia and Chile and other places. They don't work. Doesn't mean they can't work, but the one that works for us involves profits. Nothing wrong with profits, but profits aren't the purpose of corporations. My favorite example of someone who had this old-fashioned notion was actually Walt Disney, who, after one of the Walt Disney movies when he was head of the studio that didn't do all that well, he came before the press, the financial press, and he was very excited by the movie. And they said, Walt, it didn't open very well, didn't sell that many tickets. How can you be happy by this movie? Don't you make movies to make money? And he paused and looked at the financial guys and said, I don't make movies to make money. I make money to make movies. So it doesn't mean that they're not connected. It's just a question of what your mission is. Now, people think, well, that's all well and good, but directors of corporations have to work for shareholders. It turns out that's not true. in at least 37 states. There's what's called multi-stakeholder laws. Massachusetts is one. The well-known progressive state of Arizona is another one. Almost every state in New England is a multi-stakeholder state. Delaware is a multi-stakeholder state for every question in a corporation except takeover. California, ironically, is a mono-stakeholder state. If you're incorporated as a business in California, your only duty is to your shareholders. But in Massachusetts, this is from Massachusetts Chapter 156D, it gives the powers and responsibilities of directors of corporations. It says that directors of corporations may consider the interests of the employees, suppliers, creditors, customers, the economy of the state, the region, the nation, community, societal considerations, and the long and short-term interests of the corporation and its shareholders. That covers a lot of ground. It may even include the ocean. So when someone tells you that corporations have to maximize their profits as their only goal, too bad. Or that I'd like to help you, but it doesn't fit into my business plan. You can remind them that that was a choice they made. That not having a sustainable business, not having a social responsibility was a choice, but it wasn't the only choice. And it wasn't even the time-tested choice. And by George Merck's opinion, it wasn't even the choice that would give you maximum profits. So at Vertex, we've tried to run a business in which the purpose is like George Merck, for the people. And I think corporations that don't take into account sustainability, long-term sustainability, in everything they do, they're not perfect, none of us are perfect, but if you don't take account the long-term sustainability, you're not really serving society, and society is who, in the end, we all report to. So with that, let's go to our panel and questions.